Richard Hale, the billionaire, had lived most of his life surrounded by people who bowed down to his status. Every step he took was often greeted with silence or admiration. But tonight was different. It was past midnight when his car pulled up in front of his grand mansion. The black limousine, shining under the moonlight, stopped smoothly at the wide gates. The chauffeur stepped out quickly to open the door, but Richard barely acknowledged him. He was tired, more tired than usual. His long day had been full of endless boardroom meetings, polite conversations, and people pretending to agree with him just to stay in his good books. As he stepped into his house, he expected the usual feeling of control. The marble floors shone, the walls carried paintings worth millions, and every corner was a reminder of his wealth. Normally, the mansion felt quiet, but tonight it was unusually silent, almost as if it was holding its breath. Richard walked inside, loosening his tie, his shoes echoing loudly across the hallway. He had never cared much about the sound he made, it was his house, after all. But before he could even climb the staircase, a soft but firm voice stopped him. "Please, sir, be quiet." Richard turned, surprised. It was Miriam, the maid who had been working in his house for many years. She was a woman in her late 50s, with kind but serious eyes. She stood there, her hands clasped, her voice low but commanding in a way he had never heard before. Richard froze. In all his years, no one, not his managers, not his board members, not even his closest friends, had ever dared to speak to him like that. His first instinct was irritation. Who was she to tell him to be quiet in his own house? His mansion was his kingdom, and Miriam was just a maid. But something about her expression made him pause. There was no disrespect in her tone, only urgency. Her eyes held a kind of plea that made Richard hesitate instead of barking back a response. He looked around the vast hallway, trying to sense what she was protecting. The chandeliers above glimmered faintly, and only a few lamps were on, giving the house a dim, almost secretive glow. Richard narrowed his eyes. "What is going on here?" he whispered, his voice sharper than intended. Miriam glanced toward the east side of the house, then back at him. "Please, sir, just trust me. Walk softly tonight." Richard was stunned again. Trust. The word echoed in his mind. People trusted him because of his money, his power, his influence. But here was his maid asking him to trust her without any explanation. He noticed the way she stood, slightly blocking his path, as if guarding something important. Her posture wasn't rebellious, but protective, like a mother shielding something fragile. For the first time in many years, Richard felt curious instead of angry. He adjusted his jacket and lowered his voice. "Why?" Miriam hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked a few steps forward and motioned for him to follow. Richard's irritation returned, but it was mixed with curiosity now. He had always thought of Miriam as invisible, just another worker blending into the background of his mansion. Yet tonight, she was standing in front of him with unexpected courage. As they walked, Richard noticed how carefully Miriam stepped. Her shoes barely made a sound, while his polished leather ones echoed even when he tried to soften them. The mansion, usually filled with silence that made him feel powerful, now felt like it was hiding a secret. He caught faint sounds, a distant giggle, soft footsteps, maybe even a lullaby. He frowned. This was his house, yet he had no idea what was happening in it. His chest tightened. Had someone broken in? Was Miriam protecting something she shouldn't be? Or was it something harmless that she feared he would misunderstand? He thought of calling his head of security, but something about Miriam's calm yet firm presence stopped him. She wasn't panicked, only careful. Richard studied her as they moved down the corridor. He realized he had never really looked at her before. She had been working in his house for more than a decade, always polite, always efficient. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, it was with respect. Yet tonight, she looked different, stronger, more determined. They passed the gallery, where priceless paintings lined the walls. Normally Richard would have stopped to admire his collection, a source of pride and wealth. Tonight, he barely noticed them. His eyes stayed on Miriam, on the way she clutched her apron, on the quick glance she gave him to make sure he was still following. He whispered again, this time softer. Miriam, what's going on? Her lips trembled, but she didn't stop. You'll understand, sir. Just, please, no loud voices. Her words carried weight. Richard felt his pride clash with curiosity. He was not used to being told what to do, especially not in his own home. But the way she said it, it wasn't about control. It was about care. It almost reminded him of his mother when he was a boy, when she used to hush him during the rare quiet evenings they spent together. The memory softened him, and he didn't argue further. They reached the East Wing, a part of the mansion he rarely visited. It was where the staff usually worked and lived, a space he had always considered separate from his world. He seldom cared about what happened there, as long as everything ran smoothly. But tonight, he was being led into it as if it were a hidden world inside his own home. His steps slowed when he noticed faint light spilling from under one of the doors. The soft glow, unlike the cold brightness of his chandeliers, felt warmer, more human. He heard faint laughter now, the kind that came from children or families. His brows furrowed. Why would there be laughter in this part of the mansion at midnight? He turned to Miriam again. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Richard saw something he hadn't expected: fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what might happen if he reacted the wrong way. That fear was mixed with a deep tenderness, as if she was protecting something more valuable than all his millions. Richard's anger, which had been building in small waves, faded a little. He realized he didn't feel in control of the moment, and oddly, it didn't frustrate him as much as it should have. Instead, he felt a spark of curiosity, almost like a child about to uncover a secret. For the first time in a long while, Richard chose patience. He didn't demand answers. He simply followed quietly, his heart beating faster than he expected. Whatever was waiting for him behind that door, he knew it would not be ordinary. Something was about to change in his mansion, and perhaps even in his life. Richard stood still in the dim hallway, his hand brushing against the smooth surface of the wall as Miriam looked back at him with a mix of worry and determination. He had never seen her like this before. Usually, she moved quietly, doing her work without asking questions, never standing in the way of her employer. But tonight, there was something different. Her steps were slow, deliberate, almost protective, as if she were guarding a fragile secret. The mansion felt alive in a way it never had before. It was not the grandeur of its marble staircases or the glow of chandeliers that stirred Richard, it was the faint hum of life coming from the East Wing. A soft laugh. A hushed voice. Then silence again. He leaned closer, listening, his mind racing with questions. Was Miriam hiding someone? Why would she risk her job and her dignity by speaking to him so boldly? He lowered his voice, keeping his tone steady. Miriam, you need to explain what's happening. This is my house. She turned to face him, her expression calm yet cautious. Sir, please, a little more patience. I'll show you, but you must walk softly. It's important. Richard's pride wanted to resist. It was not in his nature to be ordered around in his own home. Yet, the sincerity in her eyes made him pause. There was no hint of defiance, only a quiet plea. Against his usual instincts, he nodded. They continued down the hallway. Richard's footsteps echoed loudly despite his attempts to walk quietly, reminding him of how much space separated his world from Miriam's. His shoes were polished, hard against the floor. Miriam's were soft, barely making a sound, as though she had learned to move unnoticed through the mansion. Richard felt out of place in his own house for the first time in years. He noticed how the walls here were different. The grand paintings and sculptures from his collection faded away the further they went. The east wing carried simpler touches: small framed photographs, old furniture polished with care, and warm yellow lighting instead of the cold brilliance of crystal chandeliers. It was the part of the house where the staff lived, a part he had rarely cared to visit. He realized now that he had built walls, not just of marble and stone, but of habit. There were corners of his own mansion he had never truly seen. The quietness pressed on him as they stopped in front of a closed wooden door. Light spilled gently through the gap at the bottom, and Richard could hear faint breathing on the other side. Miriam held up her hand, signaling for him to wait. She tilted her head toward the door, listening for a moment, then exhaled in relief. Richard's eyebrows furrowed. "Who's in there?" he whispered. Miriam hesitated, her hands tightening around the edge of her apron. For a moment, Richard thought she might back away. But then, with courage that surprised him, she looked him in the eye and said, "Someone who needed shelter, sir. Someone I could not turn away." Her words stirred something inside Richard. Shelter. He hadn't thought about the meaning of that word in years. To him, his mansion was a fortress, a place to rest between meetings and travels. But the way Miriam said it, shelter meant safety, protection, love. "Why here?" Richard asked, his voice low but steady. "Why risk hiding anyone here?" Miriam's expression softened. "Because, sir, it was the only place I knew would keep him safe. And because I trust that beneath all this," she gestured lightly to the mansion's wealth around them, "you still have a heart that understands." The word stung. Richard was not used to people speaking to him about his heart. Most people spoke only of his money, his power, his influence. For a moment, he didn't know how to reply. His pride urged him to remind her of her place, but his curiosity held him back. Miriam gently pushed the door open, and Richard's eyes widened. Inside, the room glowed with warmth. It was not grand or luxurious, but it carried a comfort that even his most expensive rooms never had. A soft blanket was spread across a couch. A small lamp cast golden light across the room. And there, curled up under the blanket, was a child fast asleep. His tiny chest rose and fell in rhythm, his face peaceful after what looked like a long struggle to rest. Richard froze at the sight. His mind struggled to piece together the situation. A child? In his house? Miriam stepped inside slowly, motioning for Richard to follow quietly. "This is my grandson," she whispered, her voice full of tenderness. "He had nowhere else to go tonight. His mother is going through difficult times, and I couldn't leave him alone. He's been frightened, restless. He only just fell asleep." Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. He stared at the boy. The child's small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, his hair messy, his shoes placed neatly at the side as if Miriam had taken care to treat this temporary room like a home. Memories flooded Richard unexpectedly. He saw himself as a young boy, lying awake in a large, empty room. His parents had been too busy building empires to tuck him into bed. He remembered nights when the silence of wealth had been louder than any noise. The loneliness had carved itself into him, shaping the man he had become. Looking at Miriam's grandson, sleeping soundly with people who cared nearby, stirred something deep inside. He turned to Miriam, his voice softer than he intended. "Why didn't you tell me?" Miriam's eyes shone with honesty. "Because I was afraid, sir. Afraid that you would see him as a problem instead of a child in need. Afraid that my years of service here would mean nothing compared to one mistake in your eyes." She lowered her gaze. "But I could not let him sleep on the street." Richard felt the weight of her words press against him. This was not rebellion, it was courage born from love. For the first time in years, someone in his house had acted out of compassion, not duty. He stood in silence, watching the boy's steady breathing. Miriam gently adjusted the blanket, her movements filled with care. Richard realized how little he knew about the people who worked for him. He knew their schedules, their tasks, their wages, but not their stories, not their struggles. Miriam had been more than a maid all these years. She had been a woman carrying quiet battles no one asked about. A strange quiet settled over Richard's heart. His anger dissolved, replaced with something unfamiliar. He didn't speak, didn't question further. Instead, he simply stayed in the room longer than he expected, letting the sight of a child's peaceful sleep remind him of what he had lost long ago. The mansion, which once felt cold and empty, suddenly felt different. For the first time, it wasn't the marble, the gold, or the wealth that gave it meaning. It was the quiet presence of love, hidden in the most unexpected corner of his home. Richard looked at Miriam again, and though he said nothing, she could see it in his eyes. Something was changing. Richard stood quietly in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the sleeping boy. The room was filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He was used to grand lights and cold spaces, but here the glow from the small lamp gave everything a gentle peace. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like the master of the mansion. He felt like a guest in someone else's quiet world. The child's face looked soft and calm, but Richard could see traces of exhaustion on him, tiny shadows under his eyes, the way his lips parted as though sleep was a hard-fought victory. Richard knew that kind of tiredness. He had worn it many times in his youth, though for different reasons. Back then, it wasn't because of hardship in the streets, but because of long nights spent alone in empty rooms while his parents traveled the world, building businesses that left no time for a boy. Richard's chest tightened with a memory he thought he had buried. He remembered lying in bed, waiting for someone to tell him good night. Sometimes, the maids would check on him, but it was never the same as a parent's touch. The silence of his childhood had been heavy, pressing on him with every passing night. And now, standing here, he saw a child who was spared that loneliness because Miriam had chosen to protect him. Miriam moved closer to the couch, her hand lightly brushing the boy's forehead as if checking his sleep. Then she looked at Richard, her eyes full of concern. "He's been through a lot," she whispered. "His mother works long hours and struggles to keep a roof over their heads. Tonight, she couldn't bring him anywhere safe, so I brought him here." Richard swallowed. 1,000 responses rushed to his lips. He could have reminded her that this was his mansion, not a shelter. He could have spoken of rules and boundaries. But when he opened his mouth, none of those words came out. Instead, he found himself asking, "What's his name?" Miriam blinked, almost surprised. "Samuel," she replied softly. "He's 6 years old." Richard let the name settle in his mind. "Samuel." He repeated it quietly, as though tasting the weight of it. The boy stirred slightly at the sound of voices, but then rolled over and sank deeper into his dreams. For a long moment, Richard simply watched. He felt an unfamiliar pull in his heart. Normally, children made him uncomfortable. He never knew how to talk to them, how to reach them. But Samuel was different. There was something about the boy's fragile peace that made Richard want to protect it, not disturb it. He turned to Miriam. "You risked everything by bringing him here." She nodded, her eyes steady. "I did. But if you saw how scared he was tonight, sir, you would have done the same." Richard wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew Miriam was right. He thought of all the money he had, the cars, the suits, the jewels locked in safes. None of it had given him peace, yet here was a child, finding comfort in the simple love of a grandmother. Richard felt small in front of that truth. They both stood in silence for a while, watching Samuel sleep. Richard felt a strange calmness wash over him, a calmness he had not known even in his most expensive resorts. Then a thought crossed his mind: the staff had helped her. He could see it in the way the shoes were placed neatly, the blanket tucked carefully. Miriam had not done this alone. Others in his household must have known and kept the secret. "Does everyone know?" he asked quietly. Miriam hesitated, then nodded. "Some of the staff helped. They understood. We took turns looking after him these past few days." Richard's eyebrows rose. "These past few days?" "Yes, sir," she said nervously. "This isn't the first night. He has been here before. Only in this wing. We made sure he never disturbed you. I thought you would never notice." Richard let out a slow breath. He should have been angry. A boy had been living under his roof without his knowledge. But strangely, anger didn't come. Instead, he felt a deep, aching question in his chest. How was it that in his own house, he had been blind to something so full of life? He walked further into the room, pulling up a chair near the couch. His presence seemed to fill the small space, but he tried to move quietly. He studied Samuel's face again, then leaned back in the chair, lost in thought. Miriam spoke carefully. "I'm sorry, sir. I should have asked you first. But I was afraid you would say no." Richard turned to her. His eyes, which once held cold authority, now carried a trace of weariness. "You're right," he admitted. "I probably would have." The honesty of his words surprised them both. Richard realized he was speaking more openly than he had in years. Normally, he kept his feelings locked behind a wall of power. But something about this moment, about the small sleeping boy, broke down that wall. He looked around the room. The air smelled faintly of lavender, probably from the blanket Miriam had brought. There were crayons and papers stacked on a small table, drawings of houses, trees, and smiling faces. Richard reached for one, holding it gently. A stick figure drawing showed a woman holding a boy's hand, with the sun overhead. It was simple, innocent, and yet more beautiful than many of the expensive paintings in his gallery. "Did he draw this?" Richard asked. Miriam smiled softly. "Yes. He loves drawing. It helps him feel safe." Richard stared at the paper, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Safe. That word echoed in him. He had given his staff financial security, but had he ever given them a sense of safety? Had he ever cared about their lives beyond their work? He placed the drawing back on the table carefully, almost reverently. The mansion felt different now. It wasn't the palace of silence he had built for himself, it was a place holding a secret heartbeat he hadn't noticed until tonight. For the first time, Richard understood why Miriam had stopped him in the hallway, why she had dared to whisper, "Be quiet." She wasn't protecting rules or order, she was protecting a fragile piece that a child needed. Richard leaned back in the chair, staring at the child who lay peacefully under the blanket. The boy's soft breathing filled the quiet room, and each sound carried a weight Richard didn't expect. His world, built on deals and decisions worth millions, suddenly seemed fragile compared to the innocence of a child's sleep. He found himself thinking not of profits or projects, but of nights long ago when he, too, had wished for someone to whisper that everything would be all right. Miriam stood nearby, her hands folded tightly, her posture respectful yet strong. She had just confessed her secret to him. The boy was her grandson, and she had hidden him in the mansion for days. Richard could see fear in her eyes, but also something else, courage. She hadn't done this for herself. She had risked her job, her reputation, and her security because she loved this boy enough to protect him at all costs. Richard turned toward her, his voice low but steady. "You've served this house for many years. You've followed every rule, every order. Tonight, you broke them all. Why?" Miriam's lips trembled slightly before she spoke. "Because, sir, rules cannot come before a child's safety. He was crying, hungry, and afraid. I had nowhere else to take him. If I left him alone, he would have suffered. If I brought him here, at least he had a bed, food, and people who cared. Her words echoed in Richard's mind. He had built his empire on rules, contracts, regulations, policies that kept everything under his control. But here stood a woman who had chosen love over rules, compassion over obedience. And for the first time, he did not feel anger at her defiance. He felt respect. He looked back at Samuel. The boy shifted slightly in his sleep, mumbling softly before settling again. Richard felt something stir in his chest. His voice softened. "You told me to be quiet. Why was that so important?" Miriam's expression gentled. Because he had been restless all night. He finally closed his eyes. I couldn't risk him waking up frightened again. For him, sleep is not just rest, it's escape from worry. He has been through too much for someone so small. Richard swallowed hard. The explanation was simple, yet it struck him deeply. She wasn't asking him to be quiet out of disrespect. She was asking because her grandson needed peace more than Richard needed control. That truth humbled him. He rose from his chair and walked slowly across the room. His polished shoes tapped softly on the wooden floor, and he stopped in front of the couch. He bent down slightly, studying Samuel's face in the glow of the lamp. His hand twitched as if he wanted to reach out, but he stopped himself. He didn't know how to show affection, it had been absent from his life for too long. Instead, he whispered, almost to himself, "He looks content." Miriam's eyes softened. "He feels safe here." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Safe. He had built one of the most secure mansions in the city, gates, guards, alarms, but had he ever truly made it a safe home? For him, safety had always meant protection of wealth, not protection of hearts. But here was a boy, wrapped in a blanket, finding more safety in a maid's care than in all the millions Richard had spent on marble floors and gold-trimmed ceilings. Richard stood tall again, but he felt smaller inside. He turned to Miriam. "Do you know what most people see when they look at me?" She hesitated, unsure if it was a trick question. "They see a powerful man, sir. A man with wealth and respect." Richard gave a bitter smile. "Yes. That is what they see. But what they don't see is a boy who once sat in a big house, waiting for his parents to come home. They don't see the silence that swallowed me every night. They don't see that money built walls around me, but never gave me warmth." Miriam's eyes widened slightly. She had never heard her employer speak so openly, so honestly. Richard's voice grew softer, his gaze returning to Samuel. "When you told me to be quiet, Miriam, for the first time I felt like someone was protecting something real inside these walls. Not money. Not paintings. But something that truly matters." The room fell into silence again, but it was no longer heavy. It was gentle, almost comforting. Richard sank back into the chair, his eyes lingering on the boy. Miriam hesitated before speaking. "I feared you would throw us out when you found out." Richard shook his head slowly. "I should have. By every rule I live by, I should have. But tonight, Miriam, I don't feel like following rules. I feel like listening." The admission shocked even him. He, a man who demanded control in every corner of his empire, was choosing to let go for one night, at least. Miriam lowered her gaze, her eyes welling with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, sir." The hours passed slowly. Richard stayed longer than he intended, listening to the soft sounds of Samuel's sleep, the ticking of the clock, and the quiet hum of the house. For once, he didn't feel the urge to rush off to his study, check his emails, or plan the next day's deals. He felt present. As dawn's first light crept through the curtains, Samuel stirred and opened his eyes. He blinked sleepily, confused to see a tall stranger seated near him. Richard froze, unsure of what to say. Children had always been a mystery to him. Samuel rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Grandma." Miriam stepped forward with a smile. "I'm here, Samuel." She crouched beside him, smoothing his hair. The boy glanced at Richard, his young eyes curious. "Who's that man?" Richard opened his mouth, but Miriam answered gently. "That's Mr. Hale. He owns this house." Samuel blinked. "He's tall." Richard chuckled softly, the sound surprising him. "Yes, I suppose I am." The boy studied him for a moment longer before turning back to Miriam. "He doesn't look scary." Richard's chest tightened. He wasn't sure why the boy's words touched him so deeply. He had spent his life being feared, respected, envied, but never described as not scary. It felt strangely comforting. Miriam guided Samuel back under the blanket. "Go back to sleep a little longer. It's still early." The boy nodded, closing his eyes again. Within moments, he was asleep. Richard watched silently, his heart heavy with thoughts. The mansion, once just a monument to his wealth, now felt alive with meaning. He realized that Miriam's simple act of courage had forced him to confront the emptiness of his own life. When he finally rose to leave the room, he looked at Miriam with new eyes. "You've changed something tonight," he said quietly. "Not just in this house, but in me." Miriam bowed her head, her voice humble. "I only did what any grandmother would do, sir." Richard shook his head. "No. You did more. You reminded me what it means to care." And with that, he walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps softer than before, as though he, too, had learned the value of silence. The sun had just begun to rise over the horizon, spreading golden light across the tall windows of the mansion. Richard Hale walked slowly down the long hallway, his thoughts heavy yet strangely light at the same time. The events of the night still played in his mind: the quiet request from Miriam, the sight of her grandson Samuel asleep, and the feeling of warmth he hadn't known in years. For a man who lived by order, silence, and wealth, everything had shifted. Something had broken through the walls around his heart. He entered his study, a room usually filled with papers, computers, and the constant reminders of business. Today, however, he didn't feel like checking numbers or reading contracts. He sat down at his desk and stared at the city skyline outside. The tall towers of glass and steel reflected the morning sun, but instead of feeling powerful, he felt small yet peaceful. His mind replayed the boy's innocent words, "He doesn't look scary." That single sentence echoed more loudly than the praises of business partners or the speeches at charity galas. For the first time, Richard realized that perhaps being not scary was more valuable than being important. Hours passed quietly. When he finally left his study, he walked back to the East Wing, where Samuel and Miriam were. He found them in the small dining area used by the staff. Miriam had prepared a simple breakfast: warm bread, eggs, and fruit. Samuel sat at the table, swinging his little legs, laughing softly as Miriam spoke to him. Richard paused at the doorway, watching. The boy looked healthier in the morning light, his cheeks brighter, his eyes alive. He was a sharp contrast to the loneliness Richard had felt as a boy in his own childhood home. A part of Richard longed to step inside, but another part held him back. He didn't know how to fit into such a scene. Samuel noticed him first. "It's the tall man," the boy exclaimed, smiling. Miriam quickly hushed him. "Samuel, mind your voice." She looked at Richard nervously, unsure of how he would respond now that the night had passed. Richard walked in slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good morning," he said softly, his tone kinder than anyone in the house was used to hearing. Samuel grinned. "Good morning." Miriam stood, flustered. "Sir, I didn't expect you so early." Richard raised a hand gently. Sit, Miriam. Don't stand on formality. This is your time with your grandson. She hesitated, but the kindness in his voice calmed her. She sat back down, though her eyes remained watchful. Richard glanced at Samuel's plate. Did you eat well? Yes, the boy replied, chewing happily. Grandma makes the best breakfast. Richard chuckled softly. He had eaten meals cooked by the finest chefs in the world, yet something told him Samuel was right. A meal made with love was always the best. After breakfast, Richard surprised them both. Miriam, I want Samuel to stay here for as long as he needs. This mansion has more rooms than I can ever use. It's time they served a better purpose. Miriam's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. Sir, are you certain? This is very generous. Richard shook his head. It's not generosity, Miriam. It's responsibility. You've given this house something money never could. Warmth. Family. If I can give Samuel safety, then perhaps I can finally make this mansion a home. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. She bowed her head deeply. Thank you, sir. From my heart. Samuel looked between them, not fully understanding the weight of the moment, but sensing the kindness. He hopped down from his chair and ran to Richard, wrapping his small arms around the billionaire's leg. Richard froze, his body stiff with surprise. He had not been hugged like that in years. Slowly, awkwardly, he placed his hand on the boy's head. Something inside him softened completely. From that day forward, the mansion changed. Richard began coming home earlier, no longer chasing endless late nights in the city. Instead of empty halls echoing with silence, laughter filled the air. Samuel's footsteps running through the corridors, his drawings pinned up on walls, his questions about everything around him, all of it brought life to the house. The staff, too, seemed different. They smiled more, their work lighter, as if the child's presence reminded them all of something worth protecting. Richard noticed details he had once ignored, the way the staff cared for each other, the quiet sacrifices they made daily. He began speaking to them, asking about their lives. For the first time, he saw them not just as workers but as people with families, dreams, and struggles. One evening, Richard joined Samuel and Miriam in the sitting room. The boy was drawing again, scribbling colorful houses and stick figures with wide smiles. He held up a paper to Richard. Look. This is you, this is Grandma, and this is me. Richard studied the drawing. It showed three figures standing under a bright sun, holding hands. His throat tightened. He had seen priceless art around the world, but this simple drawing touched him more deeply than any painting in his gallery. May I keep this? He asked gently. Samuel nodded eagerly. Yes. You can put it in your big room. Richard smiled. I will. And I'll frame it too. Miriam watched quietly, her heart full. She had never imagined her employer, the strict and distant billionaire, could show such tenderness. Yet here he was, slowly transforming before her eyes. As weeks turned into months, Richard arranged for Samuel's schooling, making sure he had the best opportunities while still staying close to his grandmother. He supported Miriam's daughter, helping her find stability in her life. But he did it quietly, without boasting. For Richard, this was no longer about reputation, it was about redemption. One evening, Richard found himself walking through the mansion with Samuel by his side. The boy pointed to the grand chandelier and asked, "Why do you have so many lights, Mr. Hale?" Richard looked up and then down at the child. "Because I thought light could fill the emptiness. But I was wrong." Samuel tilted his head. "What fills it then?" Richard paused, then smiled softly. "People. People you care about. That's what fills it." The boy grinned, taking his hand. Richard let him. For the first time, he didn't feel like a lonely man hiding in wealth. He felt like part of something real. And he remembered the night it all began, the night Miriam told him to be quiet. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't disrespect. It was love. The reason she had stopped him was simple yet powerful: she was protecting peace, protecting family, protecting the little boy who reminded Richard of everything he had lost and everything he still could gain. That night, Richard stood by the window of his study once again, but he was not alone. Samuel's drawing was framed on the wall. The sound of laughter floated through the mansion. For the first time, the house felt alive.